They threatened him with dues and fines, certain they had the power. But the HOA never saw the twist. He owned the bank, holding every one of their mortgages. The punch landed with a sickening crack that echoed through the aircraft cabin like a gunshot. 12-year-old Marcus Williams crumpled to the aisle floor, blood streaming from his shattered nose as passengers gasped in horror. The white man standing over him, Derek Thompson, still had his fist clenched, his face twisted with rage that seemed disproportionate to whatever had triggered this violence. Flight attendant James Rodriguez rushed forward, his training kicking in as he assessed the chaos unfolding in row 23 of Flight 447 from Chicago to Atlanta. Marcus tried to speak through the blood, his voice barely a whisper as he called for his father. The boy's hands trembled as he touched his face, feeling the warm liquid that wouldn't stop flowing. Other passengers began pulling out their phones, some to call for help, others to record what they'd just witnessed. The aircraft's captain, Robert Hayes, received an urgent call from the cabin crew about a serious passenger altercation with injuries, just as they reached cruising altitude 30,000 feet above the ground. Derek Thompson stood frozen, looking down at his bloodied knuckles as if seeing them for the first time. The businessman's expensive suit was wrinkled, his tie askew, and his breathing heavy from the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Around him, passengers whispered accusations and demands for justice, their voices creating a buzz of anger that filled the pressurized cabin. The severity of what had just happened began to sink in as Marcus's blood stained the blue carpet beneath him. In the cockpit, Captain Hayes made a decision that would change everything. He reached for his communication system, knowing that what happened next would determine not just the fate of his passengers, but potentially the entire airline industry. The emergency medical protocols were clear, but this situation demanded something more drastic. As he began his transmission to air traffic control, Hayes had no idea that the father of the injured boy possessed power that could bring their airline to its knees. The other passengers watched in stunned silence as the reality of the situation became clear. This wasn't just a simple altercation between strangers. The deliberate nature of the attack, the age difference between the perpetrator and victim, and the racial dynamics at play created a powder keg of emotions that threatened to explode. Marcus Williams lay bleeding on the floor of an airplane, 30,000 feet in the air, with no immediate way to get proper medical attention. His father, Dr. Jonathan Williams, would soon discover what had happened to his son, and his response would shake the aviation industry to its core. Dr. Jonathan Williams stood in the boardroom of the Federal Aviation Administration, his phone buzzing insistently against the mahogany table as he tried to focus on the emergency aviation safety meeting. As the newly appointed deputy administrator of the FAA, Jonathan commanded respect from everyone in the room, his decisions capable of grounding entire fleets with a single signature. When he finally glanced at his phone and saw 17 missed calls from an unknown number, a cold dread settled in his stomach. The voice message from flight attendant Rodriguez was barely audible through the aircraft noise, but the words, "Your son Marcus" and "medical emergency" cut through Jonathan's professional composure like a blade. His hands shook as he listened to the description of the assault, each word building a rage inside him that threatened to consume his normally calm demeanor. The other officials in the meeting noticed his sudden change, the color draining from his face as he processed the unthinkable reality. Jonathan's mind raced through the implications as he excused himself from the meeting, his voice steady despite the hurricane of emotions brewing inside him. Marcus was supposed to be on a simple flight to visit his grandmother in Atlanta, a routine trip they'd made dozens of times before. Now his 12-year-old son was bleeding and traumatized, trapped on an aircraft with his attacker, with no way for Jonathan to reach him or protect him from further harm. The power dynamic of the situation wasn't lost on Jonathan as he rushed to his office, his footsteps echoing through the sterile hallways of the FAA headquarters. He possessed authority that most people could only dream of, the ability to issue emergency directives that could affect millions of travelers and billions in airline revenue. But in this moment, all that power felt meaningless because he couldn't use it to heal his son's broken nose or erase the trauma from his memory. As Jonathan reached his office and began pulling up the flight tracking information for Marcus's plane, he made a decision that would test the limits of his authority and his conscience. The aircraft was still airborne, still carrying his injured son and the man who had hurt him. Every minute that passed was another minute his boy suffered. Another minute the perpetrator remained free from consequences. Jonathan's finger hovered over his computer keyboard as he contemplated an action that could end his career, but might be the only way to ensure justice for his son. The weight of fatherhood crashed into the responsibilities of his office as Jonathan stared at Flight 447's position on his monitoring screen. He thought about Marcus's laugh, his excitement about visiting Grandma, his trust that the world was a safe place where adults would protect him. That innocence had been shattered at 30,000 feet, and Jonathan Williams was about to use every ounce of his governmental authority to make sure the person responsible faced immediate consequences. FBI agent Michael Chen received the emergency call while reviewing case files in his downtown Chicago office, the urgency in the dispatcher's voice immediately commanding his full attention. A federal crime had been committed aboard a commercial aircraft, and the Bureau needed someone on the ground immediately to coordinate with both the airline and federal aviation authorities. What made this case particularly sensitive was the identity of the victim's father, Deputy FAA Administrator Jonathan Williams, a man whose cooperation was essential for aviation security nationwide. Chen's partner, Agent David Martinez, joined him as they raced toward O'Hare International Airport, their emergency lights cutting through the afternoon traffic. The preliminary report painted a disturbing picture, an unprovoked assault on a minor, witnessed by dozens of passengers, with clear evidence of both the attack and the racial dynamics involved. The FBI would need to handle this case with exceptional care, knowing that any misstep could have far-reaching consequences for aviation security and public trust. At the airport, Chen met with Skyline Airways Security Chief Robert Palmer, a nervous man whose hands shook as he reviewed the passenger manifest. Palmer had worked for the airline for 15 years and had never dealt with anything approaching this level of severity. The security footage from the gate showed Derek Thompson boarding normally, passing through all standard security procedures without incident, giving no indication of the violence that would erupt once the aircraft was airborne. The passenger interviews began immediately as Chen and Martinez worked to piece together what had triggered the attack. Witness after witness described the same shocking scene. Marcus Williams had been returning from the bathroom when Derek Thompson suddenly stood up and struck him without warning or provocation. Some passengers reported hearing Thompson mutter something about teaching respect before the punch landed, while others insisted the attack came out of nowhere. Chen discovered that Derek Thompson worked as a regional sales manager for a pharmaceutical company with no prior criminal record and no history of violent behavior. His employment record showed a successful career spanning 12 years, with positive performance reviews and no disciplinary actions. This made the sudden explosion of violence even more puzzling and concerning, suggesting either hidden psychological issues or external pressures that had pushed him past his breaking point. As the investigation deepened, Chen realized they were dealing with more than just a simple assault case. The victim's father possessed unprecedented power within the aviation industry, power that could be used for justice or revenge depending on how the situation was handled. The FBI agent found himself walking a tightrope between conducting a thorough investigation and preventing a potential abuse of federal authority that could have catastrophic consequences for the airline industry. Every decision he made in the next few hours could determine whether justice was served or whether personal vendetta would override the rule of law. Jonathan Williams sat in his office staring at the emergency powers granted to him under Title 49 of the United States Code, his heart pounding as he contemplated actions that could reshape the entire aviation industry. The Federal Aviation Administration possessed broad authority to issue immediate groundings when passenger safety was at risk, and Jonathan now had to decide whether his son's assault constituted such a risk. His personal anguish warred with his professional obligations as he reviewed the legal precedents for emergency administrative action. The phone call from FBI agent Chen had provided some comfort. The Bureau was taking the case seriously and treating it as a federal crime. But Marcus was still airborne, still trapped with his attacker, still bleeding and traumatized while bureaucratic procedures ground forward at their usual pace. Jonathan's fatherly instincts screamed for immediate action, for consequences that would demonstrate the seriousness of what had happened to his son and prevent similar attacks in the future. Jonathan pulled up Skyline Airways operational data on his computer, reviewing their safety record, passenger complaint history, and security protocols. What he found disturbed him deeply. This wasn't the first incident of passenger violence on Skyline flights, though none had been as severe as the attack on Marcus. Several reports of verbal harassment, inappropriate behavior, and minor physical altercations had been filed over the past 18 months, suggesting a pattern of inadequate passenger screening and conflict management. The legal authority was clear. Jonathan could issue an emergency directive grounding Skyline Airways' entire fleet, pending a comprehensive review of their security procedures and passenger safety protocols. Such an action would strand thousands of travelers, cost the airline millions in lost revenue, and send shockwaves through the entire aviation industry. But it would also send an unmistakable message that violence against children on aircraft would face the most severe possible consequences. As Jonathan began drafting the emergency directive, he thought about the broader implications of his decision. Other airlines would implement stricter security measures, passenger screening would be enhanced, and protocols for dealing with in-flight violence would be reviewed nationwide. His son's suffering could become the catalyst for changes that would protect countless other children from similar attacks, transforming personal tragedy into systemic improvement. The weight of the decision pressed down on Jonathan as he completed the legal language of the directive. Once he signed and transmitted this order, there would be no going back. Skyline Airways would be grounded immediately, every flight canceled, every passenger stranded, until the airline could prove they had adequate measures in place to prevent future attacks. Jonathan's finger hovered over the submit button as he prepared to use his federal authority in a way that would either be remembered as necessary justice or condemned as an abuse of power driven by personal vendetta. The transmission went out at 3:47 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, an emergency directive from the Federal Aviation Administration that would change everything. Effective immediately, all Skyline Airways aircraft are ordered to land at the nearest suitable airport and remain grounded pending comprehensive security review. The message reached air traffic control centers across the nation simultaneously, creating controlled chaos as dozens of flights suddenly needed emergency landing clearances. Captain Hayes received the order while Flight 447 was still 90 minutes from Atlanta, his experienced hands steady on the controls despite the shock of what he was hearing. In 32 years of flying, he had never experienced a complete fleet grounding, an action so drastic it was reserved for only the most catastrophic safety failures. The fact that this order came while he had an injured passenger aboard and a federal crime scene in his cabin made the situation even more surreal and terrifying. Skyline Airways CEO Thomas Richardson was in a board meeting when his assistant burst through the conference room doors with news of the grounding order. The color drained from Richardson's face as he read the FAA directive, understanding immediately that his airline was facing an existential crisis. Every minute his planes remained grounded would cost millions in revenue, compensation to stranded passengers, and irreparable damage to the company's reputation. The media response was immediate and overwhelming. News helicopters scrambled to airports where Skyline aircraft were making emergency landings. Reporters flooded social media with speculation about terrorist threats and safety failures, and the airline's stock price began a freefall that would erase billions in market value. None of them yet knew that the grounding order stemmed from an assault on a child, or that the victim's father held the power to keep every Skyline plane on the ground indefinitely. In the cabin of Flight 447, passengers sensed the tension as Captain Hayes announced their diversion to Nashville International Airport for an air traffic control requirement. Marcus Williams was receiving medical attention from Dr. Sarah Bennett, a passenger who happened to be a pediatric emergency physician, but his condition remained serious enough to require immediate hospital treatment. Derek Thompson sat in his seat under the watchful eyes of several large passengers who had volunteered to ensure he didn't cause further trouble. The implications of the grounding order rippled through the aviation industry as competing airlines scrambled to accommodate stranded Skyline passengers while trying to understand what catastrophic failure had triggered such drastic action. Airport terminals filled with confused and angry travelers demanding answers that airline employees couldn't provide because they didn't know themselves. The FAA's media office was overwhelmed with inquiries about the unprecedented action, but Deputy Administrator Williams had ordered complete silence until the investigation was complete. As Flight 447 began its descent into Nashville, Captain Hayes realized he was landing not just to address a medical emergency, but to become part of a federal investigation that would determine whether his airline survived the crisis. The grounding order had transformed their aircraft from a routine commercial flight into the center of a legal and media firestorm that could destroy careers, bankrupt companies, and change aviation security forever. Nashville International Airport erupted into controlled chaos as Flight 447 approached the runway. Emergency vehicles lining the tarmac like a parade of flashing lights waiting for an aircraft that carried more than just passengers. FBI agents, local police, paramedics, and FAA investigators had assembled what looked like a small army of federal law enforcement, all prepared to board the plane the moment it touched down. The media had caught wind of the emergency landing, and news vans surrounded the airport perimeter, their cameras trained on the runway where history was about to be made. Captain Hayes executed a flawless landing, despite the pressure of knowing that hundreds of careers hung in the balance of the next few hours. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, he could see the emergency response team through his cockpit windows, a sight that would normally indicate a catastrophic mechanical failure, but today represented something far more complex and politically charged. The FBI had coordinated with local authorities to ensure that Derek Thompson would be arrested the moment he stepped off the aircraft, while paramedics stood ready to rush Marcus Williams to Vanderbilt University Medical Center. Inside the cabin, the tension was palpable as passengers prepared for what they sensed would be an unusual deplaning process. Dr. Bennett had managed to stabilize Marcus's condition using the limited medical supplies available, but the boy needed immediate surgical attention to properly repair his broken nose and assess potential complications. Marcus drifted in and out of consciousness, occasionally calling for his father, unaware that his dad had just used the full power of the federal government to ensure justice would be served. Derek Thompson sat in his window seat staring at the approaching emergency vehicles, the reality of his situation finally penetrating the fog of anger and adrenaline that had driven his actions. He could see FBI agents waiting on the tarmac, could see the news cameras in the distance, could feel the hostile stares of every passenger around him. The businessman who had boarded the flight as an anonymous traveler would walk off as the most hated man in America, his face about to be broadcast across every news network in the country. Agent Chen coordinated with local Nashville FBI field agents as the aircraft came to a stop, ensuring that proper evidence collection protocols would be followed and that all witnesses would be available for immediate interviews. The crime scene needed to be preserved exactly as it was, every piece of physical evidence documented and collected before passengers were allowed to leave. This wasn't just an assault case anymore. It had become a federal incident that had triggered the most dramatic aviation response since September 11th. As the jet bridge connected to the aircraft and the doors opened, the organized chaos began. Paramedics rushed aboard to attend to Marcus, while FBI agents moved efficiently to arrest Derek Thompson, reading him his rights as passengers recorded everything on their phones. The boy was carefully transferred to a stretcher, his small form almost lost among the medical equipment, while his attacker was led away in handcuffs through a gauntlet of cameras and angry shouts from onlookers who had learned about the assault through social media. The emergency landing had transformed a routine flight into a media circus and federal investigation, but for Marcus Williams, it meant the beginning of his journey toward healing. As the ambulance raced toward the hospital with its young passenger, neither he nor the medical team knew that his father was already en route to Nashville, having left Washington, D.C. the moment he learned of the emergency landing. The reunion between father and son would take place in a hospital room, but it would also mark the beginning of a legal battle that would test the limits of federal power and parental justice. Jonathan Williams burst through the emergency room doors of Vanderbilt University Medical Center like a man possessed, his federal credentials clearing a path through hospital security as he demanded to see his son. The sight of Marcus lying on the examination table with his face swollen and bandaged hit Jonathan with the force of a physical blow, transforming the abstract rage he'd felt into something raw and primal that threatened to overwhelm his composure. Dr. Patricia Reynolds, the attending emergency physician, briefed him on Marcus's condition while nurses continued their work around the injured boy. Marcus's eyes fluttered open when he heard his father's voice, the relief visible even through the bruising and swelling that distorted his young features. "Dad?" he whispered through his damaged nose, the sound breaking Jonathan's heart as he gently took his son's hand. The boy tried to explain what had happened, his words coming in fragments about returning from the bathroom, the man's angry face, the sudden explosion of pain, but Jonathan stopped him with a gentle touch. There would be time for statements later. Right now, his only concern was his son's healing. The medical assessment was both better and worse than Jonathan had feared. Marcus's nose was badly broken and would require surgery to repair properly, but there was no brain injury, no permanent damage, no life-threatening complications. However, the psychological trauma was evident in the way Marcus flinched when strangers approached, the way his eyes darted nervously around the room, the way he gripped his father's hand like a lifeline. The attack had stolen more than just his physical well-being. It had shattered his sense of security and innocence. FBI agent Chen arrived at the hospital as Marcus was being prepared for surgery. His presence a reminder that this personal tragedy was also a federal case with implications far beyond one family's suffering. Jonathan met with Chen in the hospital corridor, his voice steady despite the emotional turmoil as he provided what information he could about his son's character and the circumstances of the trip. The agent was careful to separate Jonathan's role as a grieving father from his position as a federal official, ensuring that the investigation remained objective despite the personal stakes involved. As Marcus was wheeled into surgery, Jonathan found himself alone in the waiting room facing the full weight of what he had done. The grounding order he'd issued had stranded tens of thousands of passengers, cost Skyline Airways millions of dollars, and triggered a media frenzy that was growing by the hour. News reporters were already gathering outside the hospital, eager to interview the federal official who had used his governmental power to seek justice for his son. The legal and ethical implications of his actions were becoming clearer with each passing hour. The surgery lasted 3 hours, during which Jonathan paced the waiting room like a caged animal, his mind alternating between parental worry and the growing realization that his career might be over regardless of whether his actions were ultimately justified. He had crossed a line that government officials weren't supposed to cross, using federal power for personal reasons, even if those reasons were morally justifiable. When Dr. Reynolds finally emerged with news that the surgery had been successful, Jonathan felt a mixture of relief and dread. His son would heal physically, but the consequences of Jonathan's response were just beginning. The story exploded across national media like wildfire, with news anchors struggling to balance the horror of a child's assault against the unprecedented federal response that had grounded an entire airline. CNN, Fox News, and MSNBC led their broadcasts with the story, each network approaching it from different angles. Some focusing on the racial dynamics of the attack, others questioning whether Jonathan Williams had abused his federal authority for personal revenge. Social media platforms erupted with hashtags demanding both justice for Marcus and accountability for the grounding order that had stranded innocent travelers. Derek Thompson's mugshot became one of the most shared images on the internet, his face twisted with an expression that seemed to embody everything ugly about American society. The businessman's employer immediately terminated his position and issued statements distancing themselves from his actions, while his neighbors and acquaintances were tracked down by reporters eager for any insight into what might have motivated such a brutal attack on a child. The narrative that emerged painted Thompson as a man under financial and personal pressure who had snapped in the worst possible way. Skyline Airways CEO Thomas Richardson faced a media firing squad outside the company's headquarters, reporters shouting questions about security protocols, passenger screening procedures, and the airline's response to previous incidents of passenger violence. Richardson's carefully prepared statements about cooperation with federal authorities and commitment to passenger safety rang hollow against the backdrop of his company's fleet sitting idle on tarmacs across the country. Stock analysts were already predicting that the airline might not survive the financial and reputational damage. Legal experts filled television screens debating whether Jonathan Williams had acted within his authority or committed an abuse of power that warranted criminal charges. Constitutional scholars argued about the balance between federal emergency powers and personal interests, while aviation attorneys calculated the potential lawsuits that could arise from the grounding order. The precedent was unprecedented. Never before had a federal official used regulatory power in such a direct response to a personal family crisis. The passenger videos from Flight 447 circulated endlessly on social media. The brutal moment of impact replayed millions of times as Americans struggled to process what they had witnessed. Marcus Williams became a symbol of innocence destroyed, his young face appearing on magazine covers and newspaper front pages, alongside headlines demanding justice and reform. The contrast between his childish features and the violence he had endured created a visceral response that transcended typical political divisions. As the media storm intensified, both supporters and critics of Jonathan Williams organized protests outside FAA headquarters, Skyline Airways offices, and even the Nashville hospital where Marcus was recovering. Some demonstrators praised Jonathan's decisive action and demanded stronger protections for children on aircraft, while others condemned what they saw as a dangerous precedent of federal officials using governmental power to settle personal scores. The divide reflected broader tensions about race, power, and justice in American society, with Marcus Williams and his father at the center of a national conversation about how far parents should be allowed to go to protect their children. The Department of Justice convened an emergency review board to investigate whether Deputy FAA Administrator Jonathan Williams had committed criminal abuse of federal power, the panel comprising senior prosecutors and constitutional experts who understood the unprecedented nature of the case. Attorney General Patricia Coleman personally oversaw the investigation, knowing that the outcome would set precedents for how government officials could use their authority when personal interests were involved. The legal analysis was complex. Jonathan's actions were clearly motivated by his son's assault, but they also addressed legitimate safety concerns within the airline industry. Derek Thompson sat in federal detention facing charges of assault on a minor aboard an aircraft, federal kidnapping, since he had prevented Marcus from leaving by blocking the aisle, and civil rights violations for what prosecutors argued was a racially motivated attack. His court-appointed attorney, Michael Stevens, faced an almost impossible task defending a client whose crime had been witnessed by dozens of passengers and recorded on multiple devices. The evidence was overwhelming, the public outrage immense, and the political pressure for maximum prosecution intense. Skyline Airways filed an emergency lawsuit against the FAA seeking immediate reinstatement of their operating certificates, arguing that the grounding order was punitive rather than safety-related and had been issued outside proper regulatory channels. The airline's legal team, led by veteran aviation attorney Robert Kim, argued that Jonathan Williams had exceeded his authority and caused irreparable financial harm to their client for personal rather than regulatory reasons. The federal court would need to balance airline rights against FAA emergency powers in a case that could reshape aviation regulation. Congressional hearings began within days, with the House Transportation Committee demanding answers about the scope of federal aviation authority and the circumstances that led to the grounding order. Jonathan Williams was called to testify, his appearance drawing packed hearing rooms and national television coverage as lawmakers grilled him about his decision-making process and potential conflicts of interest. The hearing became a political theater where Republicans and Democrats used the case to advance broader narratives about federal power and racial justice. The FBI's investigation into Derek Thompson revealed a pattern of escalating racist behavior and financial stress that had culminated in the aircraft assault. Agent Chen discovered social media posts, workplace complaints, and personal communications that painted a picture of a man whose prejudices had been amplified by economic anxiety and personal failures. The evidence supported hate crime charges in addition to the assault and federal aviation violations, potentially resulting in decades of prison time. As legal proceedings moved forward on multiple fronts, Marcus Williams began his slow recovery in a Nashville hospital room, largely shielded from the media circus surrounding his case. His healing became the emotional center of a legal and political storm that would determine not just his attacker's fate, but also his father's career and the future of aviation safety regulations. The boy who had simply wanted to visit his grandmother had become the catalyst for changes that would affect American aviation for generations to come, though he remained focused on the simpler goal of breathing normally through his repaired nose and returning to the innocence that Derek Thompson had stolen from him. 6 months after the assault that had shaken the aviation industry, Marcus Williams sat in a federal courthouse watching Derek Thompson receive a sentence of 12 years in federal prison for his crimes. The boy's nose had healed well thanks to excellent medical care, but the emotional scars remained visible in the way he still flinched around strangers and insisted on aisle seats when flying. Thompson's conviction on hate crime charges, federal assault, and aviation safety violations had sent a clear message that violence against children on aircraft would face the harshest possible consequences, though it could never undo the trauma Marcus had endured. Jonathan Williams had resigned from his position at the FAA 2 months earlier, accepting responsibility for his use of federal power, even as legal experts remained divided on whether his actions constituted criminal behavior. The Department of Justice ultimately decided not to prosecute him, concluding that while his actions were ethically questionable, they had addressed legitimate safety concerns and resulted in necessary industry reforms. His resignation allowed him to focus on his son's recovery and avoid the political complications that his continued federal employment would have created. Skyline Airways had emerged from the crisis as a transformed company, implementing the most comprehensive passenger safety and anti-violence protocols in the industry after their month-long grounding. CEO Thomas Richardson had been forced to resign, replaced by former military officer Colonel James Martinez, who restructured the airline's security procedures and passenger screening processes. The company's stock price had recovered most of its losses, as investors recognized that the new safety measures positioned Skyline as an industry leader in passenger protection. The federal aviation regulations had been permanently changed as a result of Marcus's case, with new requirements for crew training and violence de-escalation, enhanced passenger screening for behavioral indicators, and mandatory reporting of all in-flight incidents to federal authorities. Other airlines had voluntarily adopted similar measures, recognizing that public confidence in aviation safety required more than just mechanical reliability. It demanded protection from the human threats that could emerge at 30,000 feet. Agent Chen had been promoted within the FB1 and assigned to a new task force focused on aviation-related hate crimes, his work on the Williams case establishing him as a national expert in federal aviation law enforcement. The precedents established by the investigation and prosecution had created new tools for federal agents dealing with similar incidents, ensuring that future attacks on aircraft passengers would face swift and comprehensive federal response. As Marcus Williams walked out of the courthouse with his father, both of them finally ready to move forward from the tragedy that had changed their lives, neither of them looked back at the building where justice had finally been served. The boy who had been broken would heal completely. The father who had risked everything for his son's sake had found peace with his choices, and the system that had failed to protect them had been reformed to prevent similar tragedies. The emergency order that had grounded an airline had ultimately elevated the safety and security of American aviation, proving that sometimes the most controversial actions produce the most necessary changes. The story of Flight 447 would be remembered not just as a tale of violence and revenge, but as a turning point when the aviation industry finally acknowledged that passenger safety meant more than preventing crashes. It meant protecting every traveler, especially the most vulnerable, from the human capacity for hatred and violence that no amount of metal detection could screen out. Senator Patricia Hayes, chairwoman of the Senate Aviation Subcommittee, gavelled the packed hearing room to order 6 months after the grounding incident, her stern expression reflecting the gravity of investigating federal power in the digital age. The witness table held an unprecedented assembly of power. Former Deputy Administrator Jonathan Williams, Skyline Airways executives, FBI officials, and aviation industry leaders, all prepared to testify about an incident that had redefined the relationship between personal justice and federal authority. Camera flashes illuminated the room as national media documented what legal scholars were already calling the most significant aviation hearing since 9/11. Jonathan Williams adjusted his tie nervously as he prepared to face questions that could still result in criminal charges despite the DOJ's decision not to prosecute. His attorney, former Solicitor General David Chen, had coached him extensively on how to balance honesty about his motivations with legal protection for his actions. The father who had used federal power to protect his son now sat as a private citizen, his career destroyed, but his conscience clear about the choices he had made in those desperate hours. Senator Michael Rodriguez, the ranking minority member, opened his questioning with barely concealed hostility toward what he characterized as the most dangerous abuse of federal regulatory power in decades. His line of inquiry focused on the precedent Jonathan's actions had set, arguing that any federal official with personal grievances could now justify regulatory retaliation against private companies. The political theater was obvious as Rodriguez positioned himself as a defender of free enterprise against governmental overreach. The testimony from Marcus Williams, now 13 and speaking publicly for the first time about his experience, brought the hearing room to complete silence. His voice cracked slightly as he described the moment of impact, the fear he felt trapped on the aircraft with his attacker, and his confusion about why other passengers didn't intervene immediately. Several senators wiped their eyes as the boy explained how the incident had changed his relationship with flying, with strangers, and with his own sense of safety in public spaces. FBI Agent Chen's testimony revealed disturbing details about Derek Thompson's background that hadn't been made public during the criminal trial. The investigation had uncovered a pattern of workplace harassment, online hate speech, and financial desperation that painted a picture of a man whose racist violence had been building for years. Chen's evidence suggested that without the dramatic federal response, Thompson might have faced only minor state charges that wouldn't have reflected the severity of his actions. Skyline Airways CEO Colonel Martinez testified about the comprehensive changes his company had implemented, transforming what had been seen as regulatory punishment into a competitive advantage. The airline's new protocols had prevented 3 potential in-flight incidents in the months since the grounding, demonstrating that Jonathan's emergency order had addressed real safety deficiencies rather than simply serving personal vengeance. Martinez's military bearing and detailed safety statistics gradually shifted the hearing's tone from condemnation to grudging recognition. The legal experts called to testify presented conflicting views on federal emergency powers, constitutional limitations, and the precedents established by the case. Professor Elizabeth Barnes from Harvard Law School argued that Jonathan's actions, while personally motivated, fell within the broad discretionary authority granted to federal safety regulators during emergencies. The federal correctional facility in Atlanta had housed many dangerous criminals, but few had arrived with the level of notoriety that surrounded Derek Thompson as he began serving his 12-year sentence. Correctional Officer Samuel Johnson had processed thousands of inmates during his 15-year career, but he had never seen one whose crime had triggered such massive federal response or generated such intense media coverage. Thompson's intake classification placed him in protective custody due to credible threats from other inmates who had seen the viral videos of his attack on Marcus Williams. Thompson's cellmate, Kevin Martinez, was serving time for financial fraud and possessed the kind of manipulative intelligence that made him both useful and dangerous as a prison ally. During their first conversation, Martinez probed Thompson's psychological state, recognizing the combination of shame, anger, and denial that characterized inmates struggling to accept responsibility for their actions. The businessman who had once commanded respect in corporate boardrooms now faced the daily humiliation of prison routines and the constant reminder of his fall from social respectability. Dr. Rachel Foster, the prison psychologist assigned to Thompson's case, conducted weekly sessions aimed at understanding the mental state that had led to his explosive violence on Flight 447. Her clinical notes documented a man struggling with deep-seated racial prejudices that he had never acknowledged or addressed, combined with financial stress and personal failures that had created a volatile psychological cocktail. Thompson's initial sessions were marked by attempts to minimize his actions and blame Marcus for somehow provoking the attack. The prison's racial dynamics created additional complications for Thompson's incarceration, as both black and white inmate populations viewed him with suspicion for different reasons. African American inmates saw him as a symbol of white violence against black children, while white inmates considered him weak for attacking a child and bringing unwanted federal attention to issues of racial violence. Thompson found himself isolated in a prison environment where racial solidarity typically provided protection and social structure. Letters from his former colleagues and family members arrived sporadically, most expressing disappointment and disbelief rather than support. Thompson's ex-wife, Jennifer, had filed for divorce immediately after his conviction, taking their 2 daughters and relocating to another state to escape the media attention. The dissolution of his family relationships forced Thompson to confront the full consequences of his actions, as he realized that his moment of violence had destroyed not just Marcus Williams' sense of security, but also his own children's relationship with their father. The prison education programs offered Thompson opportunities for self-improvement that he initially rejected, his pride preventing him from acknowledging the need for change. However, as months passed and the isolation wore down his defenses, he began attending anger management classes and racial sensitivity training. These sessions forced him to examine the beliefs and attitudes that had culminated in his attack on Marcus, a process that was both necessary for rehabilitation and deeply uncomfortable for a man who had never questioned his own prejudices. News from the outside world filtered into the prison through television coverage and letters from his remaining supporters, keeping Thompson informed about the ongoing consequences of his actions. He learned about Jonathan Williams' resignation, the changes in aviation security, and the continued media attention surrounding Marcus's recovery. Each update served as a reminder that his brief moment of violence had created ripple effects far beyond what he had imagined possible. Thompson's participation in a victim impact program required him to write letters of apology to Marcus and his family, though these communications were filtered through the legal system and victim advocates who protected the Williams family from unwanted contact. The process of crafting these letters forced Thompson to articulate his understanding of the harm he had caused, moving beyond legal acknowledgement toward genuine emotional recognition of his victim's suffering. As Thompson adapted to prison life, he began working in the facilities library, a job that provided both structure and opportunities for intellectual growth. His access to legal materials and news sources allowed him to follow the broader implications of his case, including the congressional hearings and regulatory changes that had resulted from his attack on Marcus. This knowledge created a complex mixture of guilt about the chaos he had caused and grudging respect for the systemic changes that might prevent similar incidents. The transformation of Derek Thompson from violent racist to reflective inmate would take years to complete, if it ever truly happened at all. His journey through the federal correctional system represented both the punishment demanded by justice and the rehabilitation required for eventual reintegration into society. Whether Thompson could genuinely change his fundamental beliefs and attitudes remained an open question, but his incarceration had at least removed an immediate threat while forcing him to confront the consequences of his actions in the most direct way possible. 2 years after the assault that had changed his life, Marcus Williams sat in his therapist's office describing the nightmare that still visited him 3 nights a week, always featuring the same angry face and the same moment of helpless terror as the punch approached his young features. Dr. Maria Santos had been working with trauma victims for over a decade, but Marcus's case presented unique challenges because his assault had become a national symbol, making private healing nearly impossible when his story continued to appear in media coverage of aviation safety and hate crime legislation. The physical healing had progressed better than anyone had expected, with plastic surgeon Dr. James Kim achieving remarkable results in reconstructing Marcus's nose through multiple procedures. The boy's breathing had returned to normal and the visible scarring was minimal, but the internal damage proved more persistent and complex. Marcus had developed anxiety around air travel that required careful management, though he had successfully completed several flights with his father using techniques learned through months of behavioral therapy. School presented its own challenges as Marcus navigated the attention from classmates who had seen his story on television and social media. Principal Robert Hayes at Lincoln Middle School had worked closely with the Williams family to create a supportive environment, but the boy's notoriety made normal social interactions complicated. Some students treated him as a celebrity, while others seemed afraid of him, as if his trauma might be contagious, or his father's federal power might somehow affect their families. Marcus's relationship with his father had grown stronger through their shared experience of crisis and recovery, but it had also been complicated by Jonathan's career sacrifice and ongoing legal vulnerabilities. The 13-year-old struggled with guilt about the consequences his assault had created for his father, despite repeated reassurances that Jonathan's choices had been his own. Family therapy sessions with Dr. Patricia Martinez helped them navigate these complex emotions while strengthening their bond as father and son. The victim impact statements Marcus had provided to the court system had empowered him in unexpected ways, giving him a voice in the process that sought justice for his assault. His testimony had influenced not just Derek Thompson's sentencing, but also the broader policy changes that emerged from the case. This sense of agency helped counterbalance the helplessness he had felt during the attack, though it also created pressure to serve as a spokesperson for causes he was still too young to fully understand. Jonathan had started a consulting firm specializing in aviation safety and regulatory compliance, leveraging his expertise while maintaining distance from the federal government that had cost him his career. The business provided financial stability for the family while allowing Jonathan to contribute to the industry reforms that had resulted from Marcus's assault. Father and son often discussed the positive changes that had emerged from their tragedy, finding meaning in the protection their experience had created for other children. The media attention had largely faded as newer stories captured public interest, but Marcus occasionally received letters from other children who had experienced similar trauma or discrimination. These communications, carefully screened by his parents, reminded him that his experience had resonated with young people across the country who felt vulnerable to adult violence and prejudice. Some letters included artwork or poems inspired by his story, creating unexpected connections with peers he would never meet. Marcus's academic performance had initially suffered due to concentration difficulties and missed school days, but he had gradually recovered his focus with help from specialized tutors and accommodating teachers. His interest in aviation, ironically, had increased rather than diminished, as he began studying the technical and regulatory aspects of the industry that had failed to protect him. The boy who had been victimized on an aircraft was considering a future career in aviation safety, transforming his trauma into purposeful preparation. The friendship networks that developed around Marcus reflected both the support his story had generated and the complexity of his social position. Some relationships felt genuine and based on shared interests, while others seemed motivated by curiosity about his experience or desire to be associated with his notoriety. Learning to distinguish between authentic connections and opportunistic attention had become an important part of his social development. As Marcus approached his 14th birthday, he had begun speaking publicly about his experience at selected events focused on aviation safety and youth anti-violence programs. These appearances, carefully managed by his parents and therapist, allowed him to contribute to causes he cared about while maintaining control over his narrative. The boy who had been silenced by violence had found his voice through advocacy, though he remained selective about when and where he chose to use it. The Williams incident, as it came to be known in aviation circles, had triggered the most comprehensive review of passenger safety protocols since the establishment of the Transportation Security Administration. Federal Aviation Administrator Carol Thompson stood before the International Air Transport Association's annual conference, outlining the regulatory changes that had transformed commercial aviation in the 2 years since Marcus Williams's assault. The industry that had once focused primarily on preventing external threats now acknowledged the internal dangers posed by passenger-on-passenger violence. Captain Sarah Mitchell, Skyline Airways' new Director of Safety, presented the company's revolutionary passenger behavioral assessment program to an audience of airline executives eager to avoid their own federal groundings. The system used artificial intelligence to analyze passenger behavior during boarding, identifying potential indicators of agitation, intoxication, or psychological instability that might lead to in-flight incidents. While privacy advocates had raised concerns, early results showed a 73% reduction in passenger altercations across the Skyline fleet. The flight attendant training programs had evolved from basic service instruction to comprehensive conflict de-escalation and crisis management curricula. Jennifer Walsh, who had been working as a flight attendant for American Airlines for 12 years, participated in the new 40-hour certification program that included psychology training, legal authorities, and hands-on practice with simulated passenger violence scenarios. The profession that had once been focused on hospitality now required skills comparable to those of social workers and law enforcement officers. Aircraft design modifications had emerged as an unexpected consequence of the Williams case, with manufacturers like Boeing and Airbus developing new cabin layouts that provided better sight lines for crew monitoring and easier access for intervention during passenger conflicts. The emergency communication systems had been enhanced to allow flight attendants to alert cockpit crews and ground authorities instantly when violence occurred, eliminating the communication delays that had complicated the response to Marcus's assault. The legal framework surrounding in-flight incidents had been completely restructured through bipartisan legislation known as the Passenger Protection Act. Federal prosecutor David Kim, who had handled the Thompson case, worked with congressional staff to draft laws that established clear federal jurisdiction over all passenger violence, mandatory minimum sentences for attacks on minors, and expedited prosecution procedures that ensured swift justice for victims and their families. Airport security screening had expanded beyond traditional weapons detection to include behavioral assessment and passenger background reviews that flagged individuals with histories of violence, hate crimes, or recent financial distress. TSA Administrator Michael Rodriguez acknowledged that the new procedures were more invasive and time-consuming, but passenger surveys showed strong support for enhanced screening when it was explicitly connected to preventing violence rather than just terrorism. The insurance industry had responded to the Williams case by developing new coverage products that protected airlines against the financial consequences of passenger violence incidents. Underwriter Patricia Chen at Lloyd's of London explained how the policies covered not just legal settlements, but also the operational costs of emergency landings, passenger accommodations, and reputation management. The availability of this insurance had encouraged airlines to implement more aggressive intervention protocols. International aviation authorities had adopted similar reforms, creating a global network of information sharing about violent passengers and standardized response procedures. The International Civil Aviation Organization had established new standards that required member countries to implement passenger violence prevention measures comparable to those developed in the United States, ensuring that the lessons learned from Marcus's assault would protect children worldwide. The economic impact of the reforms had been substantial, but largely absorbed by an industry that recognized the alternative was potentially catastrophic liability exposure. Airlines had invested billions in new training, technology, and procedures, but they had also seen measurable improvements in passenger satisfaction, crew retention, and operational reliability. The costs of prevention had proven far less than the potential costs of crisis management. Training centers like the one operated by Flight Safety International had developed specialized programs for airline executives, teaching them how to manage crisis communications, federal investigations, and media attention when passenger violence occurred. The curriculum included case studies of the Williams incident, analyzing both the failures that led to the assault and the successful elements of the response that had protected other potential victims and preserved public confidence in aviation safety. 5 years after the punch that had changed American aviation forever, Marcus Williams stood at the podium of the National Transportation Safety Board's annual safety conference, his now 18-year-old voice steady and confident as he addressed an audience of industry professionals who had implemented reforms inspired by his childhood trauma. The young man who had once been a victim had become an advocate, his presence at the conference symbolizing both the progress that had been achieved and the ongoing vigilance required to protect vulnerable passengers. Jonathan Williams sat in the front row listening to his son speak about resilience, justice, and the responsibility of adults to protect children in all environments, including the seemingly safe confines of commercial aircraft. The former federal administrator had found peace with his career sacrifice, his consulting firm having played a significant role in helping airlines implement the safety protocols that emerged from their family's crisis. Father and son had transformed their tragedy into a mission that had saved countless other families from similar trauma. Derek Thompson had been released on supervised parole after serving 8 years of his 12-year sentence, his early release contingent on continued participation in counseling programs and community service focused on racial reconciliation. The man who had shattered a child's sense of security now worked at a halfway house in Chicago, his violent past known to his supervisors and the community members he served. His transformation remained incomplete and fragile, but genuine enough to warrant cautious optimism about rehabilitation. Dr. Maria Santos had documented Marcus's journey from traumatized victim to confident advocate in a clinical study that had influenced treatment protocols for children who experienced public violence. Her research demonstrated that young trauma victims could achieve not just recovery, but post-traumatic growth when provided with appropriate support and opportunities to find meaning in their experiences. Marcus had become both her most challenging case and her greatest success story. The aviation industry had achieved remarkable success in reducing passenger violence, with incidents involving physical assault dropping by 67% since the implementation of the Williams protocols, as the new safety measures had come to be known. Airlines reported higher passenger satisfaction scores, improved crew morale, and reduced liability insurance costs as evidence that the industry's investment in prevention had generated positive returns across multiple dimensions of operational performance. Agent Michael Chen had been promoted to head the FBI's Transportation Security Division, where he oversaw investigations of aviation-related crimes and coordinated with international law enforcement agencies on passenger violence prevention. The skills and procedures developed during the Thompson investigation had been formalized into training programs used by federal agents worldwide, ensuring that future incidents would receive swift and comprehensive investigation. Legal scholars continued to debate the constitutional implications of Jonathan Williams's use of federal power, but the practical results had influenced administrative law in ways that provided better protection for both individual rights and public safety. The Williams Doctrine, as legal experts termed it, established procedures for independent review of regulatory actions involving agency officials' personal interests while preserving the discretionary authority necessary for genuine emergency responses. Congressional oversight of federal aviation safety had been strengthened through reforms inspired by the Williams case, with new requirements for regular review of passenger protection measures and mandatory reporting of industry safety trends. Senator Patricia Hayes, who had chaired the original investigation, had become a leading advocate for transportation safety, her committee's work extending the principles developed in response to Marcus's assault to other modes of public transportation. The international impact of the Williams case had been profound, with aviation authorities in dozens of countries adopting similar passenger protection protocols and establishing information-sharing agreements that created a global network for preventing and responding to in-flight violence. The assault on one American child had catalyzed improvements in aviation safety worldwide, demonstrating how individual tragedy could generate systemic progress. As Marcus concluded his speech with a call for continued vigilance in protecting vulnerable passengers, the standing ovation from the aviation professionals reflected both their respect for his courage and their commitment to the ongoing work of safety improvement. The boy who had been broken on Flight 447 had grown into a young man whose voice carried the authority of experience and the wisdom of survival. His legacy measured not in the trauma he had endured, but in the protection his experience had created for countless other children who would fly safely because of the changes his assault had inspired. Award-winning filmmaker Daniel Rodriguez had spent 18 months following the Williams family, gaining unprecedented access to their private conversations, therapy sessions, and legal proceedings for a documentary that would premiere at the Sundance Film Festival. His cameras had captured Marcus's transformation from traumatized victim to confident advocate, Jonathan's struggle with the consequences of his federal power decision, and the broader impact their story had on American aviation safety. The film, titled Emergency Order: A Father's Choice, promised to reignite national debate about the intersection of personal justice and governmental authority. The documentary crew had also secured exclusive interviews with Derek Thompson during his final year of incarceration, revealing a man genuinely wrestling with the racist beliefs that had driven his violence against Marcus. Prison psychiatrist Dr. Rachel Foster appeared on camera discussing Thompson's psychological journey, explaining how years of therapy had gradually stripped away the defensive mechanisms that had prevented him from acknowledging the full impact of his actions. The footage showed a broken man attempting to rebuild his understanding of race, violence, and personal responsibility. Marcus, now a college sophomore majoring in aeronautical engineering, had initially resisted participating in the documentary, but ultimately agreed when he realized it could serve his advocacy work. His on-camera interviews revealed a young man who had integrated his traumatic experience into a coherent life philosophy focused on justice, protection of vulnerable populations, and the responsible use of institutional power. The contrast between his articulate confidence and the frightened child from the original news footage demonstrated the remarkable resilience of the human spirit. The film included never-before-seen footage from Flight 447, obtained through Freedom of Information Act requests and passenger cooperation, showing the moments before and after the assault in devastating detail. Director Rodriguez had chosen to include this material despite its disturbing nature, because it provided crucial context for understanding both the randomness of the violence and the courage of passengers who had intervened to protect Marcus after the initial attack. The footage served as visceral evidence of how quickly safety could be shattered in the confined space of an aircraft cabin. FBI agent Chen's participation in the documentary revealed the investigative challenges posed by a case involving such high political stakes and media attention. His interviews explained how the Bureau had balanced the need for thorough investigation against pressure for swift prosecution, ensuring that Thompson's eventual conviction would withstand appeal while satisfying public demand for justice. The agent's methodical approach contrasted sharply with the emotional chaos surrounding the case, providing viewers with insight into how federal law enforcement handled politically sensitive investigations. The documentary explored the economic and operational impact of the Williams protocols on the aviation industry through interviews with airline executives, pilots, and flight attendants who had implemented the new safety measures. Captain Sarah Mitchell's candid discussion of the challenges faced by crew members trained to provide hospitality, but required to function as security personnel, revealed the human cost of transforming an entire industry's culture. Her perspective highlighted how individual incidents could reshape professional requirements for millions of workers. Former Skyline Airways CEO Thomas Richardson appeared in the film for the first time since his resignation, offering a frank assessment of his company's failures and the necessity of the reforms that had emerged from the crisis. His admission that the airline's security protocols had been inadequate, combined with his explanation of the corporate culture that had prioritized cost-cutting over passenger protection, provided crucial context for understanding how the Williams incident had been allowed to occur. The film's most powerful sequence featured Marcus and Derek Thompson in their first face-to-face meeting since the assault, arranged through a restorative justice program and facilitated by trained mediators. The encounter, filmed with both participants' consent, showed Thompson attempting to articulate his remorse while Marcus struggled to process his conflicted feelings about forgiveness and accountability. The raw emotion of their conversation demonstrated both the possibility and limitations of healing through direct dialogue between victim and perpetrator. Legal scholars interviewed for the documentary remained divided about Jonathan Williams' use of federal power, but their academic discussions were grounded by footage of Marcus's medical treatment and recovery that made abstract constitutional questions feel intensely personal. Professor Elizabeth Barnes's defense of emergency regulatory authority gained weight when juxtaposed with images of a child's broken face, while Professor Thomas Wright's concerns about governmental overreach were contextualized by evidence of the systemic safety improvements that had resulted from Jonathan's controversial decision. The documentary concluded with Marcus delivering his keynote address at the NTSB Safety Conference, his words serving as both a testament to personal resilience and a call for continued vigilance in protecting vulnerable passengers. Rodriguez's final shots showed Marcus boarding an aircraft for a flight to his engineering internship, the normalcy of his travel representing the ultimate victory over the trauma that had once made flying impossible. The film's message was clear. Individual courage and institutional reform could transform tragedy into protection, ensuring that one child's suffering would prevent countless others from experiencing similar violence. 3 years after the Williams case had transformed aviation security, United Airlines Flight 1247 from Denver to Miami became the testing ground for the new protocols when passenger Robert Kelly, a 34-year-old construction worker, began exhibiting aggressive behavior toward a Hispanic family seated near him. Flight attendant Maria Gonzalez immediately recognized the warning signs that had been incorporated into her training following the Marcus Williams assault, noting Kelly's elevated voice, racial slurs, and increasingly agitated body language as he complained about people who don't belong in America. The aircraft's new behavioral monitoring system had flagged Kelly during boarding when facial recognition software detected micro-expressions associated with aggression and prejudice, but the threat level hadn't been sufficient to prevent his boarding under the updated protocols. Captain James Murphy received the crew's alert about a developing situation and began coordinating with air traffic control for a potential emergency landing, while flight attendants implemented the de-escalation procedures that had been developed in response to the Williams case. Kelly's behavior escalated when 8-year-old Sofia Ramirez asked her mother a question in Spanish, triggering a violent outburst that mirrored Derek Thompson's attack on Marcus Williams. However, the new safety measures prevented the situation from reaching the same catastrophic outcome. Flight attendant Gonzalez activated the emergency alert system that immediately notified the cockpit, air marshals, and ground authorities, while passenger David Chen, trained in the civilian intervention techniques that had become standard since the Williams incident, moved to protect the Ramirez family. The aircraft's modified interior design allowed crew members to quickly isolate Kelly using newly installed restraint systems, while the enhanced communication protocols enabled real-time coordination with FBI agents and local law enforcement at Miami International Airport. The incident lasted less than 5 minutes from initial aggression to complete containment, demonstrating how the Williams protocols had transformed the industry's ability to respond to passenger violence before it could escalate to physical assault. Sofia Ramirez experienced terror during the incident but was physically unharmed due to the rapid intervention, her protection representing the successful application of lessons learned from Marcus Williams's assault. Her father, immigration attorney Carlos Ramirez, later testified that the crew's professional response and the other passengers' immediate support had prevented his family from experiencing the full trauma that the Williams family had endured. The contrast between the two incidents highlighted both the progress that had been achieved and the ongoing vigilance required to maintain safety. FBI agent Lisa Park, who had trained under Michael Chen's supervision, boarded the aircraft immediately after landing and arrested Kelly on federal charges similar to those that had sent Derek Thompson to prison. The investigation revealed that Kelly had been following news coverage of the Williams case and had specifically chosen to target a Hispanic family in an attempt to replicate Thompson's actions, demonstrating how high-profile hate crimes could inspire copycat violence even as they generated preventive measures. The media coverage of the United incident focused heavily on the success of the Williams protocols in preventing another child from being physically harmed, with aviation safety experts praising the crew's performance and the effectiveness of the new security measures. However, civil liberties advocates raised concerns about the behavioral monitoring systems that had flagged Kelly, arguing that such technology could be used to discriminate against passengers based on appearance, ethnicity, or political beliefs rather than genuine security threats. Kelly's prosecution moved swiftly through the federal court system, with prosecutors citing the Williams precedent to argue for maximum sentencing under hate crime and aviation safety statutes. His defense attorney struggled to mount an effective case given the clear evidence of premeditated racial violence, but the speed and professionalism of the law enforcement response demonstrated how the legal system had adapted to handle such incidents more effectively than during the Thompson case. The psychological evaluation of Robert Kelly revealed similar patterns to those found in Derek Thompson's assessment: financial stress, racist ideation, and social isolation that had culminated in violence against vulnerable targets. Dr. Patricia Santos, who had consulted on the Thompson evaluation, noted that the profile suggested a need for early intervention programs that could identify and treat individuals before their prejudices manifested in criminal behavior. The Ramirez family's experience became a case study in successful crisis response, with their rapid recovery and continued confidence in air travel serving as evidence that proper safety protocols could minimize both physical harm and psychological trauma. Sofia Ramirez's return to normal activities within weeks of the incident contrasted sharply with Marcus Williams's lengthy recovery process, demonstrating how immediate intervention and community support could significantly improve outcomes for young victims of hate crimes. Marcus Williams navigated the Massachusetts Institute of Technology campus with the quiet confidence of a young man who had survived national trauma and emerged stronger. His mechanical engineering studies focused on aircraft design innovations that could prevent future passenger violence. His freshman roommate, Kevin Park, initially knew nothing about Marcus's history until seeing his photo in a textbook about aviation safety, leading to an awkward conversation that ultimately strengthened their friendship when Kevin realized the depth of experience behind Marcus's calm demeanor. The nightmares had largely stowed by his sophomore year, replaced by dreams about designing aircraft interiors that could better protect vulnerable passengers through improved sightlines, enhanced communication systems, and innovative restraint mechanisms. Marcus's senior design project proposed radical changes to commercial aircraft layouts that would eliminate the blind spots and isolated areas where violence could occur unobserved, his academic work directly informed by the trauma he had experienced as a 12-year-old passenger on Flight 447. Professor Jennifer Mitchell, who taught Marcus's Advanced Aerospace Systems course, recognized both his exceptional technical ability and the unique perspective he brought to discussions about human factors in aircraft design. Her decision to involve Marcus in her research on passenger safety systems provided him with opportunities to present papers at academic conferences, where his personal connection to the subject matter added emotional weight to technical presentations about behavioral monitoring and intervention protocols. The campus speaking circuit had embraced Marcus as a powerful voice for youth advocacy and civil rights, his appearances at universities across the country drawing packed auditoriums filled with students eager to hear how he had transformed childhood trauma into purposeful action. His speaking fees helped pay for his education, while his message inspired a new generation of activists who saw his story as proof that individual courage could generate systemic change. Dating had proven complicated for Marcus, as potential romantic partners struggled to separate his public persona from his private identity, often feeling overwhelmed by the weight of his history or intimidated by his media presence. His relationship with Sarah Chen, a pre-law student he met during his junior year, developed slowly as she demonstrated genuine interest in his engineering work rather than his celebrity status, ultimately becoming the first person outside his family to fully understand both his vulnerability and his strength. The research internship at Boeing's design facility in Seattle provided Marcus with practical experience in implementing the safety innovations he had been studying, his work on passenger compartment modifications earning recognition from senior engineers who had been involved in developing industry responses to the Williams protocols. The internship also connected him with pilots and flight attendants who shared their experiences with the new safety measures, giving him ground-level perspective on how his childhood assault had changed their professional lives. Campus activism had drawn Marcus into leadership roles with organizations focused on hate crime prevention and aviation safety advocacy, his dual perspective as both victim and technical expert making him uniquely qualified to bridge the gap between emotional appeals and practical solutions. His work organizing campus responses to incidents of racial violence demonstrated leadership skills that complemented his technical abilities, preparing him for a career that would likely combine engineering expertise with public advocacy. The documentary about his family's experience had premiered during his sophomore year, bringing renewed media attention that Marcus handled with surprising grace and maturity, using interviews to promote aviation safety initiatives rather than dwelling on personal grievances. His media appearances showed a young man who had processed his trauma sufficiently to discuss it publicly without being defined or limited by the experience. Thompson's participation in educational programs about racism and implicit bias had evolved from mandatory compliance to genuine engagement, his presentations to criminal justice students and community groups serving dual purposes of personal accountability and public education about hate crime prevention. His willingness to discuss his crime and its consequences provided powerful testimony about the destructive nature of racist violence. Though critics questioned whether his platform inappropriately elevated his voice above those of his victims. The ongoing therapy sessions with Dr. Amanda Foster focused on preventing recidivism while addressing the psychological factors that had contributed to Thompson's original violence. His progress measured not just by compliance with treatment requirements, but by evidence of genuine empathy development and cognitive restructuring. Foster's clinical notes documented gradual but real changes in Thompson's thinking patterns, though she remained cautious about declaring complete rehabilitation given the severity of his original crime and the deep-seated nature of the prejudices that had motivated it. 10 years after the punch that had shattered his nose and changed American aviation forever, Marcus Williams stood in the Federal Aviation Administration headquarters as the newly appointed Director of Passenger Safety Innovation, his office located just floors above where his father had once made the controversial decision to ground an entire airline. The symbolic significance wasn't lost on anyone involved in his hiring, as the boy who had been victimized by systemic failures now possessed authority to prevent similar tragedies from occurring in the future. Jonathan Williams watched his son's swearing-in ceremony with pride, tempered by the recognition that Marcus's appointment represented both personal triumph and institutional acknowledgement that the aviation industry still needed the perspective of those who had suffered from its failures. The former deputy administrator's consulting firm had been instrumental in developing many of the safety protocols Marcus would now oversee, creating a family legacy dedicated to transforming personal trauma into public protection through technical innovation and regulatory reform. The ceremony was attended by many of the individuals whose lives had been changed by the events of Flight 447, including FBI Agent Chen, now Assistant Director for Transportation Security, Dr. Maria Santos, whose treatment protocols had become standard for trauma victims, and Captain Sarah Mitchell, whose airline safety innovations had been adopted industry-wide. Their presence demonstrated how a single incident of violence had created a network of professionals committed to preventing similar occurrences through improved training, technology, and procedures. Derek Thompson watched the ceremony on television from his small apartment in Chicago, his parole officer David Kim noting the mixture of remorse and pride on his face as he witnessed the success of the boy he had once attacked. Thompson's rehabilitation had progressed sufficiently for him to obtain employment as a counselor for other hate crime offenders, his personal experience providing credibility in discussions about the psychological factors that could lead to racial violence and the possibility of genuine change through sustained therapeutic intervention. Marcus's first initiative as director involved implementing artificial intelligence systems that could analyze passenger behavior patterns to identify potential threats before they escalated to violence. His technical background in aerospace engineering complemented by his personal understanding of how quickly situations could deteriorate in aircraft environments. The program represented the culmination of research he had begun in college, transforming academic theory into practical applications that could protect vulnerable passengers worldwide. The announcement of Marcus's appointment had generated significant media coverage, with journalists noting both his qualifications for the position and the remarkable journey from victim to leader that his career represented. International aviation authorities had expressed interest in adopting his safety innovations, suggesting that the influence of his childhood trauma would extend far beyond American airspace to protect children and families globally from similar violence. The Williams Foundation, established by Jonathan to support families affected by hate crimes and transportation violence, had grown into a significant advocacy organization whose research and lobbying efforts had influenced legislation in multiple states and several foreign countries. Marcus's government position would require him to step back from direct foundation involvement, but the organization's work would continue under new leadership committed to the principles of prevention, intervention, and victim support that had emerged from. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It was created to expose the harsh realities of racial violence, abuse of power, and the dehumanization faced by marginalized communities. This narrative aims to raise awareness, provoke outrage, and inspire action toward justice, accountability, and dignity for all.